Welcome back, everyone, to our weekly Facebook Live expert series. Today, we have Kate Vazquez, who's a functional medicine physician assistant, the founder of Radiant Health, and an author. She loves empowering women to reclaim their health and vitality alongside her husband. She created an online course, the Estrogen Reset, and wrote a bestseller, Estrogen Is A Bitch, to bring awareness about estrogen dominance, which is mostly what we're going to talk about today. In her practice, Kate teaches women how to naturally balance their hormones as well as use their cycle as their superpower to reconnect to themselves and tap into feminine energy at their highest level so they can create a life by design that they love living. I love that because I think when we think about hormones, Kate, we're mostly like, especially female hormones, we're just like, why do we have to endure hormones? So maybe the first question I'm going to ask you is like, why should we kind of like love and honor our hormones as women?
Yeah, absolutely. That is such a great question because I'm like growing up, it's like we were taught to just kind of dread our period, especially because it would come with those PMS symptoms, the cramps and the mood swings, the breast tenderness, the headaches. And we kind of just saw it as like a curse. And especially those that grew up in the church and learned about like Adam and Eve, it's like, because Eve sinned, we now have, painful pregnancies and when we deliver and these painful periods. And so it's like whatever culture or that you've grown up in, or even if you weren't grown in that type of situation, but just in general, just like women were it was like having periods was shameful. And but when we learn about our bodies and can really be in tune with what's happening, is actually a beautiful thing that we have. And I do believe that women, we have a superpower, and our menstrual cycles can definitely become our superpower. But if we're experiencing those PMS symptoms, it just means that there's some imbalances going in the body. And as a physician assistant too, going through Western medicine, we were also taught, like, if women have really bad severe PMS, you give them NSAID, so Advil, Aleve, to alleviate the pain. You also put them on birth control pills, to suppress the hormones, which can also reduce the PMS symptoms, or put them on anti-anxiety or antidepressant medications to help with the mood swings. But unfortunately, those are just all band-aids. They don't actually treat the root of what's going on. And so my journey into functional medicine and learning about our bodies and how all the systems are integrated together, and discovering that, those symptoms are actually not normal, and that there are things that we can do, and that there's actually hormonal imbalances, which is contributing to these symptoms. And once we can get to the root of what's going on, we can actually resolve all those symptoms. And then when we don't have those symptoms anymore, women can actually tune into their bodies, because as the hormones are fluctuating throughout the cycle, our energy is changing. And I do believe that when we're tuning into that, we can use that as a superpower, especially as we become, women in the workforce, or even if you're not in the workforce, even if you're a stay-at-home mom, but being able to keep up with the kids and learning when to like step back and nourish your body, and when you can perform at your highest. And so I think that's just so powerful. When learning that, I'm like, wow, once I balance out my hormones, I'm like, wow, I can actually tune into my energy. And before, I too was just like going to the gym, working out really, really hard, lifting heavy weight. I used to run a lot, and it was very taxing on my body. But once I was more in tune with my energy, I realized, okay, when I'm on my period, when my hormones are the lowest, to do more gentle, lighter activity, like a lighter jog if I want to run, or do more yoga, lighter weight instead of lifting heavier weight. And I actually was able to show up the rest of the month even stronger, instead of being on the path to burnout, which is what was happening before. So.
Yeah, 100%. I think women sometimes make that mistake with working out, like with CrossFit and different things. It's like, that's not, you just got to listen
Yeah.
to your body when it comes to exercise. I don't, do you know Deborah Atkinson yet? Have you met her? Okay. We've had her on, and she talks about some of the same things. It's like, you can actually get better results when you don't go at it hard.
Oh yeah.
All the time.
And that was a huge thing, because it's like, I enjoy lifting. I love lifting heavy weights. I feel strong, but I realized it was affecting my body and my hormones and my energy. And so just really tuning into that. And yeah, like you can still do CrossFit, but do that around ovulation, because that's when your energy is going to be the highest. You're going to be the strongest. And then during the other times of your cycle, like do different other types of exercise, do more cardio, more strength, or different types of strength training, yoga, Pilates, that kind of thing, to really honor your body.
Okay, just for people who are on live, thanks for being here. And if you have any questions as we go, feel free. So I feel it's kind of funny. We talked about honoring your hormones and how great they are. Your book is called Estrogen Is A Bitch. So I guess that's when it's imbalanced. And then you wanted to title this talk Estrogen, the Goldilocks hormone, which I guess means just the right amount. I shared before we got on, I just saw a physician's assistant here, which is pretty cool. You have the same training, probably similar to you. She's doing more of a functional approach now. But she said that on that particular day of my blood draw, my estrogen was low. But she said that like at my age, it could be kind of bouncing up and down, and that's gonna potentially cause some problems. So maybe talk about actually, since we've implied like how the cycle works, and maybe later we can go on into menopause, but like how does estrogen flow in the cycle?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is such a great question, because as I mentioned, the hormones do fluctuate. And so yeah, I do believe I say estrogen's a bitch, because yes, it can definitely be a problem when it gets imbalanced or there's excess amount in the body. But at the end of the day, it is a Goldilocks hormone, because you want that right amount of estrogen in the body in specific phases of the cycle. You don't want too little and you don't want too much, because as we see with women, as they go through menopause and their estrogen starts to decline, they are more at risk of development of a lot of chronic disorders, because they lose that protectiveness that estrogen does provide. But when women are younger, still cycling, excess amount of estrogen is also not good either, because then it contributes to a lot of estrogen dominant disorders. So to answer your question, in terms of the estrogen through the cycle, when women start their period, all the hormones are at their lowest baseline level, and that's estrogen, progesterone, follicular stimulating hormone, also known as FSH, and luteinizing hormone, which is also known as LH. And so usually women will have a period for about 3 to 5 days. And then once we stop menstruating, then the hormones start increasing. So we start to get an increase in FSH. LH starts to increase a little bit, but also we get an increase in estrogen. Then in the first phase of the cycle is the follicular phase, which starts day 1 of the period, and then it goes until ovulation. So a woman that has an average 28-day cycle, the follicular phase is usually about 14 days, and day 14 is when ovulation occurs. So after the period, we start to get that increase in estrogen, FSH, and LH, because FSH is preparing the egg, it's maturing it in order to it to be released at ovulation. And right before ovulation, we get a really high surge and peak in estrogen, testosterone, and LH. And when that happens, that's when the egg gets released from the ovary. So this is why a lot of women will feel their best right before ovulation, because I know there are certain times in the month I feel like I'm on top of the world, and that's because I'm ovulating. And so if you ever experience that, that's why. It's because of our hormones. Our hormones are peaking, and then so ovulation can occur. And once ovulation occurs, now women go into the second half of the menstrual cycle, and that's the luteal phase. And that's when all the hormones start declining. And then progesterone will start to increase during this phase, because now if say the egg was fertilized, now the body's getting ready for pregnancy. So if implantation occurs, progesterone is what maintains and sustains pregnancy. It's the pregnancy hormone. So we get to that increase in progesterone levels. Now, around days 19 to 22, when progesterone is at its peak, we also see a little bump in estrogen as well. And this is important, because when looking at estrogen dominance, this is the time of the cycle that I am doing testing to look at women, especially if they're experiencing a lot of symptoms of estrogen dominance or hormonal imbalances, to see what is the ratio of estrogen to progesterone. Because I don't want to see a lot of estrogen in the system during this time. And that's days 19 to 22 of a regular 28-day cycle. And that's when progesterone is going to be at its peak. And so once that occurs, then, oh, beautiful. You have a beautiful diagram. Yeah, which is great. I love visuals. And you can see that, right there in that luteal phase, progesterone is in the dark blue with estradiol, which is the estrogen that, you see that little bump there too. You see that high bump of estrogen right before ovulation and that little bump under progesterone. That's what we should be seeing when hormones are balanced. But yeah, that should be the normal pattern. However, estrogen dominance basically is an imbalance of that progesterone to estrogen ratio during that time, the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle. And so what I've come to find is that there are three different phases, or it's not phases, excuse me, three different patterns of estrogen dominance. And the first pattern that I'll typically see is progesterone in normal levels. And so when I'm checking that through blood work, it should be normally 15 to 25. And so normally women, if they're at 15 to 25, that's a normal level of progesterone, but their estrogens are really, really high compared to that. And there really isn't like an optimal level for estrogen. Typically what I'll look for is estrogen at like 200, 250, 300. That's really, really high, especially for this phase. Women should be around 100, 150 for estrogen, especially when comparing to progesterone. So the second phase I will typically see is low progesterone. So it's less than 15 and normal levels of estrogen. So estrogen might be 100, but progesterone is like 10, which is really, really low. The third pattern that I'll see is low progesterone and really high levels of estrogen. So progesterone, for example, will be like 10 and estrogen will be like 200 or 300. So it's just a lot of estrogen in the system with really, really low levels of progesterone.
Okay, so this is all basically still cycling woman. So actually, a lot of our audience is postmenopausal. What can you tell us about estrogen for this group?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Yes, because that does apply to women that are cycling. But as women start going into menopause, the first hormone that starts to decline is progesterone, because women no longer, their cycles start becoming longer and longer until they disappear because they don't need progesterone for pregnancy. So that's the first hormone that starts to decline. So if there's estrogen still in the system, that's going to create that estrogen dominance effect too. So actually, I should say there are 4 types of estrogen dominance patterns, which will include the subset of women that are in menopause. And so they can still experience a lot of the same symptoms. And actually, a lot of women that will go through menopause will actually start experiencing PMS symptoms, even if they didn't experience it when they were younger. They'll have the PMS symptoms, the cramping, the headaches, the mood swings all of a sudden out of the blue, but that's because the progesterone levels are dropping. And so then that creates this estrogen dominance effect in the body until estrogen starts to decline as well.
Okay. Sorry, I was just looking at some images for those and trying to see. Okay, so yeah, Pamela was asking about exercise because you talked about like when to lay off and off. So yeah, how about exercise for postmenopausal? What should women think about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the same applies. It's always good to have a balance in the type of exercises that you do. So even women in menopause should not be doing CrossFit high intensity all the time either, because when it comes to the building and breaking down of our muscle mass, we want to make sure that we have that rest and recovery period too. Plus, it's also very taxing on the adrenals. So we're seeing a lot of women that are just like constantly hitting the gym, doing those high intensity all the time. And now they're having adrenal issues as well. So it may not necessarily impact the sex hormones, because as the sex hormones decline, but it's impacting other systems in the body, especially the adrenals. So it's really, really important that when exercising is good. You definitely want that weight bearing exercise to continue to have those strong bones, strength training to maintain that lean muscle mass, but also flexibility like yoga, Pilates, which is important as well, because as we get older, we stop moving as much, and that's when a lot of problems like people are more likely prone to fall because they're not as flexible. They don't have that balance like they did when they were younger. So it's still really, really important to have different types of exercises that you're doing and not doing the same type of exercise.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think there's stretching, cardio, and strength. And usually there's one or two of those you don't like to do or that you avoid, right? So all I can do is I love strength training. I could do that all day. And I like cardio in some forms, like, if it's outdoors, but I really won't do it indoors. And then stretching, it's like I like it once I start. I have a hard time sometimes getting started. So I think we usually have to focus on the things that we avoid a little bit.
Well,
So we're
and find different ways too. Like with cardio, it doesn't necessarily have to be running. There's different ways to do cardio, like riding your bike or jump roping or even dancing. There's so many different platforms and things out there that can help give you that same benefit of cardio. So you just find the activity. If you don't like a certain type of cardio, find a different type of cardio that you're going to enjoy better.
Yes. So what are the symptoms of estrogen dominance?
Yeah, that is the big question. So with estrogen dominance, what I will typically see is irregular periods because, as I mentioned, we have that fluctuation of the hormones, and it's really important for progesterone to peak in the luteal phase. So what I'll commonly see when women have like the second and third pattern, when progesterone levels are lower and progesterone's not peaking, that actually is really, really important because that's going to send signals to the brain like pregnancy has not occurred. And so that's going to allow the endometrium to shed for women to have their period. But if there's that progesterone's not peaking and increasing and decreasing, it's not sending those signals to the body. And so the body doesn't know, like, okay, is it time to have the period or not? And then there's just all this excess estrogen built up in the body. And so women will have a lot of irregular periods. And that's why we also see women, like, as they go through menopause, they're having like these more like erratic, sporadic periods. It's not occurring every month anymore because of that decline in progesterone. And so that is the first symptom that I'll typically see with, move out of the way because of the sun, with estrogen dominance, and also heavy periods too, because if there's a lot of excess estrogen in the body, what happens is estrogen is important for increasing the endometrial lining, which is that inner lining of the uterus. And that's really important, especially as when a woman is cycling to get ready for pregnancy. But this is also important in women who are in menopause, because if they still have a lot of estrogen in their system and they have a thickened endometrial lining, this will cause heavy bleeding. And it can also increase the risk of like uterine cancer or endometrial cancer, when there's a lot of excess estrogen in the system. So I'll typically see a lot of heavy bleeding, a lot of clots. The third symptom I will see is those PMS symptoms. So, the severe menstrual cramps, the mood swings, and the cramps occur too from that excess estrogen, because what happens is right before our period, we get a release of prostaglandins, and prostaglandins are these chemicals that increase inflammation in our body and cause the uterus to contract. And so these prostaglandins are actually what contribute to the cramping. But when there's a lot of estrogen in the system, it's going to increase even more prostaglandins. And so women will experience even more severe PMS cramping than normal because of those excess estrogen. Plus, the low progesterone levels also contributes to the anxiety, the depression, the mood swings, the irritability, the headaches, the insomnia, not sleeping well. And that's another important thing, because women, we don't realize how important progesterone is. And that's another hormone that doesn't really get talked about, because progesterone is our feel-good hormone. It makes us happy. It makes us calm. It's basically nature's natural Valium. And it also helps us to sleep really good at night. So if progesterone levels are low, or as you're going through menopause, they start declining, that's when we get the insomnia, the headaches, the mood swings. So the fourth symptom of estrogen dominance is breast tenderness, because excess estrogen in the body will cause the breast tissue to swell. So that's another common symptom that I'll typically see. And also women, especially as they're going through menopause, are more likely to develop fibrocystic breast disease. So they're developing these cysts and nodules in the breast because of this excess estrogen that's present. And then the last symptom that I typically commonly will see with estrogen dominance is weight gain, especially in the butt, hips, and thighs. And that's because as we go through puberty, estrogen is responsible for our curves in the butt, hips, and thighs. But when women start gaining excess weight, and that's where it primarily goes, we know it's most likely due to this excess estrogen in the body. And it's interesting because when women gain weight, especially in certain areas, like in the abdomen, for example, we know that's more metabolic, that's more adrenals. But when it comes to the butt, hips, and thighs, that's more estrogen dominance.
That's an interesting little tip that I don't think most people know about.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say we suspect estrogen dominance. First of all, should we always get tested before we start going to mess around with lowering it? Okay. Yeah.
Oh yes. I highly recommend definitely test first, because you can Google estrogen dominance and it will give you like all the supplements to help to balance out the estrogen. But the problem is that if you take certain supplements, like for example, DIM, which is diindolylmethane, is very, very popular supplement for estrogen dominance. And what it does, it really helps support the metabolism of estrogen through the liver. There's two phases of estrogen metabolism, phase 1 and phase 2. And it only supports phase 1, but not every woman needs support with phase 1. And so what happens is a lot of women, when they'll take DIM, sometimes they feel worse. They'll get headaches, they'll get cramps. They'll feel much, much worse when they take it. And that's because there's a lot of estrogen that gets backed up. It's not actually being pushed forward to being metabolized out. And that's because it doesn't need to be supported in the first place. So it's really, really important that you get the testing done first, because looking at the different pathways of estrogen metabolism determines where the support is needed. And as I mentioned, estrogen metabolism goes through the liver first. You get phase 1 and phase 2, and then it goes to the intestines, which is phase 3. And so what I typically like to do, I start with blood testing first, just to check the basics: progesterone, estradiol, and estrone, because a lot of practitioners only check estradiol. So make sure that estrone is getting checked as well, because estrone is really, really an important estrogen that if it's too much, what I typically like to see is estradiol higher than estrone, because if estrone is higher, it's going to produce these metabolites, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment. And that's going to be very important to figure out where we need to support estrogen through estrogen metabolism. And so I'll start with the blood work first, just to see, the levels, progesterone 15 to 25, estradiol should be about 100. And then if I see that estrone, say estradiol is like 100 and estrone is like 150, then I'm like, ooh, we need to check estrogen metabolism. And so then we'll then do a urine test to check the estrogen metabolites, because then estrone gets metabolized into 3 different metabolites, which is very, very important, especially women that are going through, before menopause and even during menopause, because the first metabolite is called 2-hydroxyestrone. And this is what DIM helps to support. And what I like to see is high levels of 2-hydroxyestrone. And that's important because it actually protects our DNA and reduces our risk of breast cancer. The next metabolite that I look at is called 16-alpha hydroxyestrone. And this should be like no to like like not detected. Because if this metabolite is really, really high, it actually causes proliferation, meaning increased like growth of cells, especially cancer cells. So if there's any cancer cells present in the body, especially like in the breast and the endometrium, the uterus, it's going to increase the risk of cancer. And so we really, really want to make sure that those levels are low. And if these levels are high, I think of gut health, because that's going to be important. I'm going to talk about that too in a moment. But the third estrogen metabolite is 4-hydroxyestrone. And this also needs to be low to like below the limit, because unlike the 2-hydroxy where it's protective, the 4-hydroxy actually damages DNA and increases the risk of breast cancer. So when I'm looking at these 3 metabolites, I want to see the first one high and the last 2 low to below the limit. Because if the last 2 are high, then I worry that there's going to be an increased risk of breast cancer later down the road. And it's interesting because when you think about breast cancer, the statistics show that 9 to 10% of women that get breast cancer actually have the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes. The other 90% don't have the BRCA1 and BRCA2. So it makes you wonder, like, why are these women that don't have the gene, don't have a family history, why are they getting breast cancer? And that's because these metabolites aren't being looked at. And I do believe if we check these metabolites, we can really reduce the risk long before the cancer develops. And that's not just breast cancer, but other estrogen related type cancers, including like thyroid, lung, intestinal, because we have estrogen receptors all over our body. And so I do believe that it's really, really important that we're doing the testing, because, you know, like I mentioned, DIM does help increase 2-hydroxy. So if I typically see women with the low 2-hydroxy, then I recommend DIM. But if DIM is high, they don't need if the 2-hydroxy is high, they don't need the DIM. If 16 alpha is high, I like to check the gut and see what's going on there. If 4-hydroxy is high, then I think of methylation. And methylation is the pathway that actually repairs our DNA, and it's responsible for the production of DNA. And so what this means is that methylation is needed, or B vitamins are needed for methylation to occur, such as B12 and folate. And so if the 4-hydroxy is on the high side, then I'm checking the B12 and folate status, because that's going to be helpful to help metabolize the estrogen. So as estrogen is going through the liver, phase 1, it goes from its active form to its inactive form. And then as it leaves phase 2, it then binds to bile and then goes to the intestines. And that's going to be phase 3 of estrogen metabolism. And so when I'm looking at the gut, the next test that I like to do is a stool test. And that's because I'm looking at the microbiome, and the microbiome is so incredible. It's like trillions of microorganisms, so bacteria, parasites, yeast, viruses. I mean, there's so many organisms in the gut, but what I'm really looking at is the types of bacteria, because bacteria, yeast, and parasites, because we have what's called the estrobolome, which is a very fancy word for estrogen and microbiome combined. And this is basically all the bacteria in the gut that's responsible for this estrogen metabolism to help shuttle out this inactive estrogen as it leaves the liver, so it gets eliminated out of the body. And so it's important that this pathway is happening, is occurring, that we're supporting these healthy gut bacteria for this process. The problem occurs when there's imbalance of all this bad bacteria. It's called dysbiosis, when we have an overgrowth of bad bacteria and yeast and parasites. And so when that happens, I do the stool test to see what does the good versus the bad look like. Are there any yeast? Is there any parasites that we need to go in and treat? And then something called beta glucuronidase, which is an enzyme. And this enzyme is supposed to be very low. And that's because it will allow estrogen to pass through. But when there's that dysbiosis, this enzyme increases in the gut, and it actually turns that inactive estrogen back into its active form, which is what we don't want, because our body should be using estrogen and then getting rid of it. And so when it turns back into this active form, now the body thinks that estrogen is ready to go, ready to be used again. And so we start reabsorbing it back into the body. And then that's where this estrogen dominance can occur as well. And so when I'm seeing these higher levels, I will sometimes recommend something called calcium D-glucarate. It doesn't help lower beta glucuronidase, but it does help to shuttle that estrogen out, so we can get rid of it until we work on the gut, because that beta glucuronidase won't decrease until you work on the gut and whatever is causing that. I know it was a very detailed explanation, but
no, I
basic-
love it. I took a bunch of notes. I mean, I think that that's really what our audience likes, is really getting into it, because they kind of know the basics, but yeah, hold on. I was just writing this last note about the
So basically, basically I do the blood test to start, and then I look at the urine and then the stool to get the overall picture of what's going on with the hormones, with the gut, with the metabolism of estrogen. Because if there's imbalance, now I know how I need to treat it to really help support those pathways, reduce the risk of breast cancer and those symptoms of estrogen dominance.
I love it. I love it. Okay. So we've gotten kind of up in there some solutions potentially too. We've got the calcium D-glucarate, we've got the DIM, methylated B vitamins. Maybe kind of what I learned, I don't know what test you use, but we use Dutch and we use the GI map. So when that beta glucuronidase is high, you can also just work on fixing the gut to get that number lower. So I think that was probably kind of implied in what you said. So you can work on the gut. You can take some of these supplements if they're the right ones for you. What are some other ways to get estrogen in check?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, my fear is always going back to like the basics, starting with food, nutrition. It's going to be so important because it's interesting because if you think about DIM and calcium D-glucarate, they're coming from our food. Granted, when you're taking it as a supplement, it's at a concentrated amount, but it's still important that we're getting these nutrients from our food. So the first thing I like to focus on is increasing those cruciferous vegetables, so broccoli, cabbage, bok choy, really increasing that, because that's really going to support phase 1 and actually phase 2 a little bit. And another important nutrient that I like, and sometimes we'll supplement with, depending on how bad someone is sulforaphane. And that's going to be it's a really powerful antioxidant. So when cruciferous vegetables are raw, they contain something called glucosinolates. So people with thyroid disorders should definitely avoid eating raw cruciferous vegetables. But when these vegetables get steamed, those glucosinolates actually get converted into sulforaphane. And sulforaphane is a really, really powerful antioxidant to help with detoxification, help with estrogen metabolism. So I always say, don't fear these vegetables, especially if you have thyroid disorders. I mean, I wouldn't recommend like eating tons every day, but if you steam it, it's going to convert those compounds into better compounds that are better for your body. That's not going to impact your thyroid. So definitely focusing on these cruciferous vegetables to really support phase 1, and the sulforaphane actually supports phase 2. So you got the DIM for phase 1, sulforaphane for phase 2. And also fiber, lots and lots of fiber, because then you're also going to be supporting phase 3. So supporting the microbiome, making sure that you're having a regular bowel movement every single day. And it's interesting because in PA school, I learned like when someone has bowel movement, regular is what is regular for them. Like if they're going every 2 days, that's normal. If it's like every 3 days, and I'm like learning about functional medicine, I realized that's not good. That's not normal, because we need to be going at least once a day. If you go 2 or 3 times a day, that's fine. Any more than that, that's a problem too. So 1 to 3 times a day is how often we should be going, because we're eliminating a lot of toxins. We're getting rid of a lot, of those inactive estrogens. So it's not building up in our body, which is really, really important. Another thing is also fermented foods. Fermented foods too is really good. It contains those probiotics, but you do have to be careful, because sometimes when people have that dysbiosis, sometimes people will have an overgrowth of bad bacteria into their small intestines called SIBO. And when you eat fermented foods, that can make you feel a lot worse. So you can get really bad bloating and cramps. So yeah, if you haven't had testing yet and you eat those foods and you realize that it makes you feel worse, avoid them for now, get the gut checked. And then you can, once the gut has healed, you can bring those back in, because at the end of the day, you really want to support those healthy gut bugs. So that's the first way to really help support estrogen metabolism. Another way is seed cycling. I love seed cycling, and women, whether they're cycling or even if they're menopausal, can do this too, because it really helps support One, it's food. Again, it's food. Two, it's a really, really easy way, an easy thing that you can do. And it really helps support the metabolism production of estrogen and progesterone. And so if you haven't heard of seed cycling, what I like to do and recommend is to take flax and pumpkin seed, take a tablespoon of each, the whole seed, and grind them up fresh every day. So 1 tablespoon flax and pumpkin seed, grind it up every single day for 14 days. Then after 14 days, you're going to take sesame and sunflower, 1 tablespoon of each, and grind them up fresh every day, and do that for 14 days as well. So it's basically you're following the menstrual cycle. Even if you're not menstruating anymore, you can still do this and you still get the benefits from it. And when you do that, you're basically alternating the seeds every 2 weeks. So the pumpkin and the flax for the first 14 days support the metabolism and production of estrogen. And then the sesame and sunflower is going to support the production and metabolism of progesterone. So that was really profound for me, especially when it came to balancing out my hormones and really reducing those symptoms of estrogen dominance. So that's the second thing that you can do. Oh, another company that I really, really love that I discovered recently is called Bio Wellness, which has those seeds already put in to phase 1 and phase 2 for you. So all you have to do is just scoop it and take it every day, which is awesome. And let's see, the third way that I really recommend supporting estrogen metabolism is making sure that you're getting in those specific nutrients, especially the B vitamins, to support that phase 2, that methylation. And again, that can come from food. So a lot of leafy greens, but also recommend testing too, because most of us are still not getting enough of those B vitamins, even from food. And I discovered I was deficient myself because there are some people that can contain a mutation of a specific gene called the MTHFR gene. And this gene, if you have 1 or even 2 mutations, you require a lot more active form of B vitamins. And you have to be careful too, because not all supplements contain the active form. So definitely want to increase your B vitamins, get your levels checked before taking it. And also magnesium. Magnesium is also another really important mineral that supports the estrogen metabolism. And that's because it works on phase 2. And there's another gene called the COMT gene. And if we have a mutation of that gene, that just requires more magnesium as well. So really, really loading up on the nutrients to help support. Also, fatty acids. So omega-3 fatty acids is going to be really important to also help support those progesterone levels too. Then the fourth way to really help support estrogen metabolism is reduce stress. And this is like, we talk about stress a lot, but it does impact estrogen metabolism as well, because stress on the body is going to also cause lower progesterone levels, especially if women are still cycling. We'll see like lower progesterone levels. And the first thing I think of is stress and whatever the adrenals doing, because all our sex hormones are produced from cholesterol and our sex hormones and cortisol. So if we are under a lot of stress, that cholesterol is going to pull more towards cortisol and less towards progesterone, because then progesterone is then supposed to go on to produce our other sex hormones like testosterone, and then it gets converted to estrogen. So we really want to support that pathway, because when our bodies are stressed, it's not thinking of reproduction. And that's the pathway it's going to pull towards when our bodies are relaxed and in a calm state. But when we are in that fight or flight mode, it's going to be pulling more towards producing more cortisol. And so when our bodies are under a lot of stress, high levels of cortisol also increase inflammation. When there's higher levels of inflammation in the body, we tend to also produce a little bit more estrogen as well. So we really want to lower stress. And by doing that, I always recommend daily self-care activities. And it doesn't have to be for like an hour or two. What I like to do in the morning is just take 10, 15 minutes and do some meditation or journaling. You can also do some yoga as well. At nighttime, I recommend doing a wind down routine, especially before bed, because especially if we're on the go, it's important that we create a wind down routine to help our bodies to calm down. And so what I'll do is I'll typically like read, I'll read a book. You don't want to read a horror book or anything like that. That's going to rev up your nervous system, but read something that's calming, take an Epsom salt bath, drink some chamomile tea, you know, things like that, just to really help calm down the nervous system. And then the last thing that I recommend to really help support estrogen metabolism is to eliminate toxins and to also detox the body. And toxins are everywhere. It's so crazy because the products that we use in our home, on our body, even the cookware, plastic, storage containers, all these things contain xenoestrogens, and xenoestrogens are foreign chemicals that look like estrogen and attaches to estrogen receptors in our body. So we really want to look at all the products that we're using, because this is going to contribute. Our body is going to think that there's more estrogen than there really is. So we want to look at all the products. I recommend Environmental Working Group. That is a great resource to look at what you're currently using. Also, 2 apps that I love. One's called Think Dirty. The other one is called Yuka, Y-U-K-A. And these 2 apps contain a scanner, which you can scan all the products that you're using to tell you how clean or dirty these products are. And then when you're in the store, you can scan the products in the store to find better options. So I highly recommend download those apps if you don't have those yet, and start looking at what you're using and make better alternatives and swaps. And as far as detoxing, definitely hydrate. Make sure you're going to the bathroom every day, and sweating. You want to sweat a couple times a week, but just being mindful, how you're sweating. Sweating, you can do that through those high intensity exercises, but don't do that all the time. But you can also go to the sauna as well. The sauna is another great way to help sweat and detox your body from all these toxins.
Awesome. Thank you. That was a lot of great tips. There's a couple questions that came in. First one was about soy, good or bad?
Oh, yes. Great question. So I do believe, and I actually talk about this in my book too. So soy, yes, it does contain weak phytoestrogens. And I do believe that there are benefits to consuming soy, but you just have to be careful of what type of soy that you consume, because there are good quality sources of soy and then there's bad. So I highly recommend getting soy that is organic and non-GMO and consuming edamame, tofu, and tempeh. Those are the only sources of soy that I consume, and I make sure they're organic and non-GMO. And there's actually studies that show that soy is protective, especially against breast cancer, because it does get a bad rep. And a lot of people are told like, oh, avoid soy, it can cause breast cancer. But if you actually look into the studies, there are 2 estrogen receptors in the body, especially in the breast. One is estrogen alpha, the other is estrogen beta. And if estrogen beta is activated, it actually it turns off the cancer genes and reduces your risk. If estrogen alpha is activated, it increases your risk of breast cancer. So these studies, when looking at soy, it actually attaches to these estrogen beta receptors. So it's actually reducing our risk of breast cancer. But again, you have to make sure it's the right quality of soy that you're consuming. Now, what I don't recommend is anything that's processed. So soy milk, soy cheese, hydrogenated soy oil. I am primarily plant-based, but I don't eat any of those soy meat alternatives because they're highly processed. Like I said, I do the edamame, the tofu, and the tempeh, and that's all that I do to get my protein. And so yeah, I do believe that the quality of soy matters. And if you're sticking to those 3 sources, organic, non-GMO, you'll be fine. And there's so many benefits from soy. It actually it does have all the essential amino acids, a great source of calcium. So really good protein that you can get from soy. Just avoid all those processed forms. But that is a very great question.
Awesome. Yeah. And then there was a couple more. Pamela asked, which form of magnesium do you like?
Yeah, I love magnesium. It's my favorite mineral. I call it the miracle mineral. But yeah, there are so many different types of magnesium out there. And so my favorite type of magnesium is magnesium glycinate, because it is the most bioavailable magnesium. And this also has like a calming effect as well. So I typically like to take it at bedtime to help my body to calm, to relax. Another form that I really love is magnesium 3 and 8. And this actually it's the only magnesium that crosses the blood-brain barrier. So I typically like to take this in the morning so it can cross the blood-brain barrier, especially if women or men are having a lot of migraines. This is a really good magnesium for that, because most people that have magnesium tend to be deficient in it anyway. So magnesium 3 and 8 and magnesium glycinate are the two that I highly recommend. I definitely recommend avoid magnesium oxide unless you're highly constipated, because it can definitely give you the runs. But if you're constipated, that means there's some issues in the gut that needs to be addressed, and you probably have a lot of estrogen in the body as well.
Great. Well, last question, let me go back to it, was Barbara was asking, what about fermented food if there are mold problems? I can piggyback that one too.
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, because with fermented foods, they also contain histamines. And actually, I do want to touch upon this too real quick. Histamines, when people have mold, they're going to be very sensitive to anything that's going to create this histamine response in the body. And so, yeah, you definitely want to avoid those histamine foods until you get the mold addressed. You calm that histamine response. But also, when there's a lot of histamine in the body, whether it's, from mold, or people have histamine intolerance or mast cell activation syndrome, this can actually also trigger estrogen dominance. And that's because estrogen and histamine attach to H1, so histamine 1 receptors. And so when there is a lot of, and another thing too, is when there's a lot of histamine in the body, it actually can increase and cause more estrogen to be produced. And then if there's a lot of estrogen, that can also flare up histamines in the body. So it becomes like this vicious cycle. And I talk about this in the book too. So yeah, it's very important when you have issues with mold to avoid the fermented foods until you get the mold addressed. And I've worked with a lot of clients too that have had mold, have had histamine issues. Once we clear that out of the body, and first and foremost, get rid of the source of mold, because you're not going to fully heal until you get rid of the source of the mold. But once you get rid of that, detox your body, heal your body, then you can bring those fermented foods back in and just see how you feel. Now, if you still react, there are different ways that you can actually increase probiotics in the body, because there are specific probiotics you also want to avoid, like Lactobacillus acidophilus is one of those probiotics that actually increase histamines. And I talk about this in the book. There's like 4 different types of Lactobacillus bacteria that increase histamines in the body. But Seeking Health is a really great company that has, it's called Probiota Histamine X, that contains probiotics that aren't going to increase those histamines in the body. So any of my histamine mold clients, I recommend that probiotic for them, so that way they can at least repopulate that gut bacteria and it's not flaring up those histamines.
Awesome. That was a great explanation. Yeah. And I would say too, Barbara, like it's kind of case by case. Like at one point when I was still in my moldy house, but I was like religious with my diet, I could tolerate a lot of fermented things. Yeah. But like later I couldn't, and it just kind of depends. So I think you can just sort of test out your own body. And then you mentioned the SIBO, if you're getting bloated from eating these things, and like kombucha, sometimes people overdo it, so you don't need like 16 ounces. You could just take like a couple ounces at a time. So there's some ways to kind of experiment through. We have some of your resources I've put in, but let me put them in again. So you've got, and maybe I'll show you your freebie too. So you've got a freebie related to your book, and then you've got a course. Is the course like always running or a certain time?
Yeah, it's always up on the website, so you guys can access it at any time. But yeah, it's a deeper dive into estrogen dominance. So there's different things in the book versus the course. But I created the Estrogen Reset course to teach women about it. Also, especially for those that are cycling, because then I talk about how to track your cycle, which is really important. Because it's crazy. Like a lot of us growing up, we weren't taught like how to track our cycles and the importance of that. So if that's something you're interested in, I highly recommend the Estrogen Reset course. But I also dive deep into the specific foods, and also different ways of self-care, help you walk you through like creating a self-care routine, a wind down routine. So everything that we've touched upon here, we'll go in a little bit deeper with that. But yeah, as far as the book, I am gifting you guys a PDF version of my book. And we're going to talk even deeper. I'll go through those different patterns of estrogen, those metabolites that I talk about, that I'll typically see, doing the Dutch test, the urine test, and just really dive deeper with that as well.
Awesome. Yeah. I just want to encourage, because I know so much of my audience is postmenopausal. Like, we still have hormones postmenopausal, and I think there's a lot of things you can learn from this topic. I love like the 3 phases and how to support them. It's like cancer prevention, which is really important as we get older too. So I noticed when I was a little deeper in the women's health space, people would be like, well, if it doesn't have to do exactly with like where I feel I'm at in my life, I'm not interested, but we always have hormones, and it's really just how they're manifesting at that point in your life. So I would say just be open to still learning about your hormones at every age. I mean, I just share, I'm learning my estrogen is a little wobbly at my age. And even though I'm certainly not like a high estrogen type, it does, I'm definitely having like more PMS, and some of you don't have the typical symptoms. Like I'll have like little leg twitches or like other things that I can tell are hormonal because they cycle. So yeah, I'm gonna download it too, because I still need to learn about my estrogen. So thank you so much, Kate. I love that you really dove into the science there. I know my audience really appreciates it. And yeah, let's just keep in touch and keep supporting people.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me today. And you guys had amazing questions, and it's just been a pleasure of mine to be
Really
here.
nice. Yeah, we'll take a couple weeks off for the holidays, everyone, and then we will be back in the new year. Bye, everybody. Thanks again.